And this week's Voices of Valor, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel from right here in Eastern North Carolina. He's reflecting on a lifetime of service and the unforgettable moment that he shared with President Ronald Reagan. Here's Pete Benton's story. So kind of tell me about your childhood.
Had a wonderful childhood. All of my mentors, Mariah, were U.S. Marines and Navy guys from World War II. As a matter of fact, my father, who served in Korea with his best friend Jerry Kingsley, and also General Paul J. Fontana, started scouting. Okay, we were the best equipped Boy Scouting troop in the southeastern United States. Okay, there were 3 Eagle Scouts in my family, thanks to them, and I always admired them for their faith, for their patriotism, for being so involved. I mean, from Little League, Boy Scouts, to church, to sporting activities and everything. Cherry Point Marine Corps Air Station, the Marines and the Navy guys have really made Havelock, North Carolina a great city. We affectionately call it Mayberry, North Carolina. It's where everybody knows everybody and loves each other. And could not have had a happier upbringing. Dad was chief of police of Havelock. Mom was telephone operator. And a lot of my relatives laughed. They said, well, your pa was the sheriff of Mayberry, and Barney Fife was your uncle, and Aunt Bee was your aunt. So, but happy days, wonderful times, a simpler life. Everyone, everybody got along, okay? And we had a sense of community there in Havelock, which I'm very appreciative.
So kind of tell me why you decided to leave that and go to the military.
Well, a number of reasons. The U.S. Marines. One in particular was a guy named General Paul J. Fontana, who, with my dad and Jerry Kingsley, started scouting. And he was an extraordinary human being. He immigrated from Italy when he was 9 years of age. Okay, came to America to realize this great dream here, to live in this wonderful country. And he joined the Marine Corps in World War II. He trained at Cherry Point as a Marine aviator. Went to, I think he spent 3 or 4 years in the South Pacific. You've heard about the famous battle where the Army Air Forces and the Marine and Navy pilots cornered Yamamoto, Admiral Yamamoto. Well, General Paul J. Fontana, at the time, who was a captain, was one of the men who shot down Yamamoto and was nominated for the Congressional Medal of Honor and received the Navy Cross. He was one of our mentors and an exceptional man. And my dad would call up General Fontana and say, General, the Boy Scouts have got some camporees coming up. He'd say, call Colonel Smith over there at Base Supply and tell him to give you whatever you need. The Marine Corps band would come to entertain us at camporees. The Marine Corps mess kitchen would come to feed us. And we had all the best camping equipment that you could get.
And tell me about your experience in the military. What did you do?
I started out originally, I was going to go to the U.S. Naval Academy. Congressman Walter B. Jones nominated me to the U.S. Naval Academy. And I had an opportunity to go to the prep school in the academy, and I chose to go enlisted, okay, which I'm kind of glad I did, because later on it made me a better Air Force officer, okay. I served in Norfolk, Virginia from 1973 to 1975, so I'm a Vietnam era veteran. And right at the end of the war, I did 3 Mediterranean cruises, and I think we did a world cruise all around the world. It was an exciting time to be serving our nation, but it was also a time of bonding with fellow Vietnam veterans. I had a number of friends in the various branches, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Army, who served in Vietnam. And I recall on our final cruise, just before the war ended in 1975, we were placed on standby on USS Forrestal to go to Vietnam and be prepared to bring the guys home. I've actually had the privilege to meet some of the Vietnam veterans who survived the Hanoi Hilton. One was a gentleman from Suffolk, Virginia. His name was Colonel Fred Cherry. Fred Cherry, I met him when I was in the Presidential Honor Guard. A good friend of mine said, Pete, I want you to come to the Oak Club tonight. I want you to meet a real hero. And Colonel Fred Cherry was an extraordinary gentleman and the nicest, most down-to-earth guy you'd ever want to meet. And he shared the story. He was spent almost 6.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton. And what was interesting there in Vietnam, you've heard the stories, how they communicated was by Morse code. They would tap each morning. And what these guys did, they became a band of brothers. They literally took care of each other. Fred Cherry and others who were brutally beaten and tortured by the North Vietnamese, when the guys would come back, they would go to him and they would try to heal his wounds and comfort him. They would share scripture. They would kind of, sing songs and everything like that. And it was just very, very touching. And Colonel Fred Cherry, for his extraordinary heroism and everything as a resident of the Hanoi Hilton, was awarded the second most prestigious Air Force Cross for what he did. He literally saved the lives of some of his fellow prisoners, and the conditions, and you'll find that a lot of the World War II veterans and Vietnam guys don't say much about what they went through. But I vividly recall that many of my Vietnam brothers who served said two things about Vietnam, and they said, especially at the Hanoi Hilton, what were the two things that were the most inspirational that just kept you going? He said two things. Number one, we believed in God. Number two was the love of our families. That's what kept them going.
And is that what kept you going as well?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, when I walked the shores in 2010, you know, I went to Germany. I was a senior war plans officer. I worked on the war plans for the defense of Israel in Europe. And to walk the shores of Normandy, where my uncle earned the Bronze Star for valor at the Battle of the Bulge, was extraordinary. It really brought it all home. And I just wish that I had the resources. I would love to take all the veterans and their spouses, take them to Normandy, to Sword, Juno, Cayenne, and St. Mary-Galais, and let them walk there with the greatest generation. June the 6th, 1944, 10,000 courageous men and one of the greatest sea armadas in all the world would land on those shores and those beaches, and 10,000 men would die that day. It was one of the most epic, extraordinary things I've ever seen in my life. And I recall when I was in the Honor Guard, when we would do Joint Service Presidential Honor Guard wreath laying ceremonies at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier with President Reagan. The first time I did it, the Air Force always stands on the corner. You're lined up. It's the Air Force, the Marines, then it's the Army, then it's the Navy, and then the Coast Guard. And we were always just a couple of feet away from the TV cameras. And I remember calling my mother in Havelock and telling Mom, I said, Mom, you know, on Memorial Day, I'm going to be with President Reagan at the Tomb of the Unknown. It had to be one of the most emotional experiences of my life because I was a young honor guard officer. And when I stood there and I saw these veterans, the Medal of Honor, the Silver Stars, the Navy Crosses, and I saw these veterans in wheelchairs who were missing limbs, I thought, how lucky I am to be an American.
And so for you, what are those values that the military has instilled in you to become who you are today?
I'm going to reflect on it. 1962 in June, when General Douglas MacArthur, of course, of World War II fame, when he addressed the military academy at West Point, he said this: the greatest act of religious training is sacrifice. All gave some gave all. And sometime I'll have to bring you the poem, Daddy, What is a Vet?, written by Father Dennis Edmund O'Brien. It's one of the most beautiful poems that I've ever read. And President Reagan said it so well: the price of freedom has always been high, but we Americans have always been willing to pay it. It's the brave and courageous men since the inception of our great country that have been willing to give their lives for something much greater than themselves, for God and country. And I had those mentors from World War II when I grew up in Havelock, Cherry Point. And I always admired and respected them, and I wanted to be just like them, and that's why I served.
So do you have any particular other experiences that you can reflect on for the military?
Oh.
Tell us about those.
Oh, absolutely. One in particular, we, on the Presidential Honor Guard, they only pick the top 1% in the military, okay? You receive a top secret presidential access clearance, okay? And they came all the way back here to Craven County and did a complete background check on me, okay? And when I was selected for the Honor Guard, my mother and dad were beside themselves. They were so happy that their son was selected. And to have the privilege to have served under Ronald Reagan was next to becoming a man of faith, becoming a Christian. Serving Ronald Reagan was a blessing beyond measure. One ceremony in particular, we would do all the ceremonies at the White House, the Pentagon, Arlington National Cemetery. And of course, Arlington National Cemetery is one of the most sacred national shrines in America today. Quick story, historical facts about Arlington National Cemetery. Do you have any idea who used to own that property? George Washington. It's one of the most beautiful scenes. Arlington National Cemetery overlooks the Potomac. George Washington originally owned that land, and he gave that land to his granddaughter Custis, who married Robert E. Lee. And that's why at Lee Mansion, which is up on the mountain there, on the very highest, the flag there always flies at half-staff. You have approximately 375,000 people who are buried there, 260 Congressional Medal of Honor recipients. You have 2 presidents, John F. Kennedy. You also have Taft. President Taft is buried there, and a lot of other, civilian dignitaries, senators, congressmen, etc. But that first time with President Reagan on Memorial Day, when we performed that joint service full honor wreath laying ceremony, was the one that has to be the most memorable. Of all the ceremonies I did on Memorial Day with President Reagan and then Veterans Day with Secretary Weinberger was just incredible. And what's interesting too with President Reagan, a lot of his staff members were World War II guys. Okay, Secretary Weinberger was he was an enlisted man. He served under MacArthur's intel staff in the South Pacific, went on to become a captain, then he got out. Ronald Reagan served in the U.S. Army Air Corps. He started out as second lieutenant, made it all the way up to captain, was about to be selected for major, but he had bad eyesight. That's why he couldn't serve on the front lines. He made something like 440 training films, for the military. But one particular ceremony, the White House ceremonies were very special. That's when a head of state, a king, a queen, some high-ranking dignitary would come. And on Tuesdays, we would have a major Armed Forces full honor welcoming ceremony. They would set up the cannons, the 105 howitzers over there at Lafayette Park, and we would all line up and march up. But one particular ceremony, it was in June of 1987 that I'll never forget. It was one of those precious moments that just sticks in your mind. It was President Eduardo Duarte of El Salvador. He came there to meet with President Reagan. We did the arrival ceremony. Okay, there's certain sequences, and what's interesting, we rehearsed for hours and hours and hours, okay, be it a presidential inaugural, be it as a matter of fact, I was recalled to do Ronald Reagan's state funeral, okay, back in 2004. But on this particular day, there's a very set ceremonial script. When we march up on our, on our marks, and what's interesting, the reason why we look so symmetrical and everything, we have marks. They're called toe marks, okay? Well, the presidential band was there, the honor guards were there. We do the what's called the ruffles and flourishes. They play the national anthems, the Salvadorian, and they play the American national anthem, and then they do a thing called trooping the line. And something happened that day was totally out of sequence, okay? When President Reagan and President Duarte were trooping the line going around, they walked back up on the stage. And all the protocol guys, I was watching them and looking at them, all of a sudden, President Duarte stepped off the stage. He walked over to the Joint Service Color Team and did something I've never seen anyone do. He leaned over and kissed the American flag. And I looked up on the stage. Ronald Reagan was crying. It was just one of the beautiful moments that you never forget. It makes you proud to be an American.
Well, it seems like you're tearing up over that.
Yeah.
It gets you every single time.
Sure it does. I was a part of history. I literally witnessed history. And there's another interesting story about Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump.
Okay.
At the White House, whenever there were special ceremonies, White House dinners and stuff, and they do all kinds of ceremonies, President Reagan will always have, and Mrs. Reagan, they'll have like, a military officer beside them. And they line up, and when there's people coming through the receiving line, they'll get their names, they'll lean and say, Mr. President, this is so-and-so, this is Mariah, so-and-so and her family. Well, on this one particular night, President and Mrs. Reagan were in line, and they'd already seen several people coming through. He turned to Mrs. Reagan and looked at her and smiled, and when he turned back to look at the next guest, he just stood there for several seconds. He was captivated. And there was an aura, there was something very dynamic and very spiritual about this man. He was a tall, kind of light-colored hair, blue-eyed gentleman, very dynamic, very charismatic about him. And he leaned over to Nancy Reagan and he said, honey, this guy's the future president of the United States. Do you know who it was? Donald Trump. Ronald Reagan knew then. He thought a lot of Donald Trump and had great respect for him. And I think that's a fascinating story. Many of us who served in the honor guard go on, because we have the top secret security clearance, presidential access, to become Secret Service agents and to become, FBI agents, ATF, law enforcement. And matter of fact, one of the former guys that served with me, Tom Sullivan, was on a ceremonial flight with me when I was deputy commander. He went on to become the commander of the Uniform Division of the Secret Service. And President Trump, in his first administration, called Tom back to be the commander again of the Uniform Division Secret Service. We have the military, another interesting fact, now the Army and the Marines have what's called a specialized security mission for the White House, the Pentagon, and the Congress. So in the time of any maybe attack on Washington or social upheaval or whatever, they will actually, the Army and the Marines will deploy to the White House, to the Pentagon, and to Congress to protect the President, the members of Congress, and also the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
When you were growing up, did you ever in your wildest dreams think you would witness all of this in your lifetime?
Interesting you say that. I'm glad you brought it up. I shall never, ever, ever forget President John F. Kennedy. I always admired and loved him and thought he was just an extraordinary president. World War II veteran, PT 109, was highly decorated for saving his shipmates, okay? Interesting thing, I'll never forget, November 1963, I think it was November 23rd, he was assassinated. And that's the day I've often said that America just stopped. You know, everyone just thought, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable, okay? When I saw the Presidential Honor Guard escorting his body to Section 3A in Arlington National Cemetery in 1963, I was a very young boy. And I looked at my dad and my mother and I said, someday I want to be a Presidential Honor Guardsman. And little did I know, a couple of decades later, that dream came true.
Why is it, you know, just not to put my personal stories in here, but no, just to say it always happens like that. People, they say they wish for something, and then even though it shows up years later, it still shows up in your lifetime. And how do you feel about that? It's just...
Well, it's divine inspiration, divine intervention. I think God granted my wish. You know, and my mother was beside herself when I called her and told her I'd been selected. She said, I love you, you're my son, and I'm so proud of you. And I said, well, Mom, I'm happy, I love you. And I said, I can't thank you and Dad for making me the man that I am. You know, life is a beautiful blessing. Enjoy it to the fullest, okay? And there's another good quote from Ronald Reagan that I really like, and kind of talking about politics. He said, we are more than just Democrats and Republicans. We are Americans. He helped, Ronald Reagan, I think, single-handedly helped to reunite this country and make us proud to be an Americans. Now, cool story. We've all know the song, God Bless the USA with Lee Greenwood, right? Okay. Did you know that Ronald Reagan and Lee Greenwood were good friends when he was governor? Lee Greenwood grew up in Sacramento, California. Lee's father served in the U.S. Army in World War II, retired as a colonel. He's married to a former Miss Tennessee. They have 2 sons. They live in Tennessee. Lee used to perform a lot with the Air Force Band, okay? And we would do the Daughters of the American Revolution concert series, the Spirit of America and all of this. And just a blessing and a wonderful opportunity to be in Washington during that time. I was talking to Lee many, many years ago. And I was, chatting with him about a couple of things. We had a meeting. And I asked him, I said, Lee, why did you write God Bless the USA? And he kind of smiled and he looked at me and he said, Pete, the reason why I wrote God Bless the USA is to reunite the country. Okay? I got teary-eyed. And I said, next to God Bless America is sung by Kate Smith, who's from North Carolina, written by Irving Berlin. That's what uplifted the World War II generation, was God Bless America, okay? I paused for a minute, and with tears in my eyes, I looked at him and I said, do you know who inspired you, Lee? And he kind of looked at me kind of funny, and he said, kind of shook his head, and I said, God inspired you. He had tears in his eyes. He said when he first sang God Bless the USA for President Ronald Reagan, he said President Ronald Reagan stood up and was crying. He said there wasn't a dry eye in the room. So. And there was another instance, he told me, he said that he was to perform, I want to say it was President Nixon, President Ford, there was 4 presidents. He was called to California at a special ceremony. And he said that when he hit the point, and I'm proud to be an American, and I would gladly stand up next to you and defend her today. He said Ronald Reagan stood up. And with tears in his eyes, said everybody just stood there like this. I'm like, wow. Now more than ever, I believe that the greatest men and women are those who believe in God and love this country. A little kind of interesting, when I was in graduate school, I taught political science at ECU. I'm fascinated with American history. In particular, the 55 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, every one of those men were believers. Okay. Now, some of them, like Jefferson and others, there's some political debate about this, were, deists. but they did believe in a higher supreme being. They would say the Holy Father, the chosen one, whatever. Of those 55 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, 29 of those men were theologians, and 29 of those men fought in the Revolutionary War. Okay? Is there anything else I need to say? We were founded on Judeo-Christian values, Mariah, a belief in God and a love of country. And I tell people, how is it that 13 fledgling, loosely tied colonies could stand up to the greatest sea power and the greatest army in all the world and defeat them? It's by the hand of God. There's no other conclusion I can draw. And as a matter of fact, I've met Tim and David Barton of the Wall Builders. They're Christian historians. They tell some beautiful stories about things that happened in the Revolutionary War where it seemed like the Americans were going to be slaughtered, and all of a sudden something happened to change the course of the tide of the war. George Washington, there's a beautiful story that's in the history books about, he was a very religious man, okay? And they said there's a story where one day he was just overwhelmed and exhausted, and he knelt down beside his horse and he started praying. There was a British spy off not far away, and he was watching George Washington pray. He ran back, jumped on his horse, rode back to the British generals, and he told the generals, he said, there's a problem. He said, General Washington is a very strong Christian, and he's praying. He said there was something very spiritual about that experience. When they crossed the Delaware, when they were going to engage the British and everything like that, and they attacked, the British forces on the other side of the river, when they retreated, there was clear skies. And as the American forces retreated, they were being shot at and attacked by the British. All of a sudden, a fog came in and covered them, and the British lost the Americans, and they made it safely to the other side. That's divine intervention. And there's several stories with George Washington. You find bullet holes in his lapel. He had 3 or 4 horses that were shot out from under him. How did he survive? How did he survive?
Speaking of divine intervention, is there a time in particular that you can recall where you maybe called on divine intervention to help you during one of your experiences?
Yeah, there's a number of times where in 2006 I was diagnosed with cancer. Okay, I had 2 back-to-back surgeries, and fortunately the surgeon who did my surgery was my golfing buddy, and we served together in the Air Force Reserve. And they almost lost me on the first surgery. And months later after the surgery, Doug would tell me, Doug Holmes, Dr. Doug Holmes is a dear friend. He said, Pete, he says, your surgery was very challenging and we almost lost you. And I said, Doug, I could feel it. He said, Pete, he said, in all my years of being a surgeon, he said, there was something very spiritual. He said, there were some very protective forces. There were some angels that were watching over you. He said, you came so close to dying, but you survived. I said, it was the hand of God. I said, I'm convinced. I said, I could sense, almost kind of like an out-of-body experience, but I knew there was something there protecting me, and it was angels. And he said, I felt the same thing. He said, something was guiding my hand. He said, of all the years of being a surgeon, I just felt there were some kind of supernatural forces were guiding my hand. And we saved you. And I said, it was by God's hand.
We're so glad you're here to talk to us today. We're here to talk to us today to tell us this amazing story.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I've been blessed more than I deserve.
What are you going to tell somebody else if they want to join the military?
Oh, my goodness. It's the best thing you'll ever do. When I was in Germany as a war planner, I had a lot of German friends, Israeli friends, and allies. And my German buddies told me, Mariah, they said, Pete, the best thing I ever did was to join. The military in Israel has compulsory service. 2 years right out of high school, you go join the military. Okay? They said at the time, I didn't particularly like it, but I realized the importance of serving my country and protecting my country. And all of my German buddies and Israeli buddies said, absolutely. And that's what I'm telling young people today. And again, my heroes were World War II men and women who I looked up to and respected and admired and wanted to be just like. And I think I've made some of the most enduring friends. I literally have friends all over the world. People I've served with overseas, friends in Germany and all over. And I'm grateful for that. The beautiful part about serving the military, too, it gives you a sense of purpose and meaning in your life. Okay? It gives you a sense of direction of where you want to go and what you want to do. There's an old saying, you got to be a good follower before you're ever a good leader. Okay? It teaches you so many skills. And I think another important thing is discipline, respect. I mean, any veteran will tell you the flag means the world to us. Those beautiful, those broad stripes and those bright stars of that glorious red, white, and blue mean the world to us. And certainly another one of my favorite sayings is that only veterans know the price of freedom because we paid for it with our blood, sweat, and tears. America the Beautiful, and there's so many wonderful people when you read these stories who've come from north, south, east, west. They come from all over the world to America to realize the beauty of living as free men and free women to enjoy the blessings of liberty. 1602 in Jamestown, the colonists came here to escape religious persecution. Okay, 1620 was the first permanent settlement. Okay, Reverend John Winthrop, who was on the Mayflower, they had a special prayer, and it's interesting because Peggy Noonan got this inspiration for the shining city by the sea. When Pastor John Winthrop, and they made the Mayflower Compact and everything like that, they dedicated this country to God. That's why our motto is, "In God We Trust." Okay, and I thought it was so touching and so beautiful. What he said is that, and many of like I said, 29 of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were theologians. They were so much brighter than we were back then. They read the classics. The Bible inspired the writing of the Bible. It's just like it said that, God through natural law has given the power to the sovereign people, not the government. Our founding fathers and mothers realized that when you place great power in a small group of people, that the propensity for abuses of power and tyranny is very high. And it's incredible. Look at Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Look at the brave, courageous men and women who stood up and said, no, we will not live under British tyranny, under British rule. And I really believe that God's divine supernatural hand is what gave the Americans victory. Okay, 2 countries were paramount in helping America finance the war, the Revolutionary War. It was the French and it was the Dutch. And when you stop and you look, especially World Wars I and II, you look at Korea, Vietnam, etc., the heroism, the beauty of this country is our people come from all over the world. You can come to America with nothing and you can achieve something.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.